Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
What happened with the October surprise makes Watergate look like a garden party.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. In the late 1970s, the United States found itself at the center of a hostage crisis, with 52 US embassy staff held hostage in Iran. Our latest episode takes you on a journey through the tumultuous events of 1980, exploring the covert operation known as the October Surprise that allegedly influenced the outcome of the US presidential election of that year. At the heart of the story is William Casey, a brilliant yet enigmatic figure who played a pivotal role in Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign. Our guest, Craig Unger, is an investigative journalist with decades of experience. He's written a new book on the subject, Den of Spies, Reagan-Carter and the Secret History of the Treason that Stole the White House. I'm delighted to welcome Craig Unger to our Cold War conversation.
It's a real-life spy story with secret meetings taking place all over the world and weapons being sold illegally to Iran.
Can you just set the scene before we get into the detail? What is the situation 79 into 80, the Carter presidency and Reagan's campaign?
In 1979, the Iranian Revolution was one of those events that's had true lasting effect on world history and changed the whole setup of world affairs, all the global relationships. Iran, under the Shah had been installed by the CIA as a really brutal and repressive ruler in Iran. He modernized Iran. He became a very reliable ally of the United States and Israel. He had a huge military that was largely American weapons. And he also was a source of an enormous amount of oil for the entire Western world. So when he was overthrown, everything was in disarray. The global affairs were in disarray. Old line Republican CIA hardliners were just agog that President Jimmy Carter had lost Iran and they wanted to do something. It was also a presidential election year, 1980 coming up. Reagan was running against Jimmy Carter. And as the election proceeded, the entire election became about whether or not Jimmy Carter could win release of 52 American hostages being held by Iran. If he won them, he'd be a hero, and a wave of patriotic fervor would win him re-election. If not, Reagan would win.
Now, these 52 hostages have been taken hostage by Iranian armed students who took over the embassy, but the Iranian government's not really doing anything to free them. They're happy for them to be held hostage. And behind the scenes, there's a guy called William Casey, who was the campaign manager for Reagan. Can you just tell me a little bit about him? Because he's key to this story.
Bill Casey is one of my favorite characters I've ever written about. He's truly a brilliant, brilliant master spy. I describe him as being sort of a mix between James Bond and Mr. Magoo. He mumbled incessantly. In fact, that was his nickname. And one of the jokes when he became head of the CIA was that all the top officials needed scramblers on their phone, but not Bill Casey, because no one could understand him anyway. He spilled food all over his shirt, and he was known to chew on his necktie in meetings. He would shout out to one person here, another there, going in 6 different directions at once. No one seemed to know how everything tied up. He compartmentalized everything. But he was truly a master spy. And at the time of the October surprise in 1980, he became Ronald Reagan's campaign manager, but he had no governmental authority whatsoever. And it's really extraordinary if you think about it. Running a presidential campaign is an enormous job. 24/7, you're in the media spotlight. But off to the side, Casey managed to get weapons shipments to Iran in violation of an arms embargo, to travel all over the world, meeting secretly with Iranian leaders in Madrid and Paris and so forth, and executing a very, very sophisticated and complex covert operation.
And so this is to try and turn the hostage crisis to Reagan's advantage, because if they can delay the release of the hostages post-election, then Carter doesn't get that bounce in the numbers there. But this is completely illegal and treasonous, what Casey's up to.
Yes, there's a law called the Logan Act. It's almost, I think, never actually been enforced, but it prohibits private citizens from interfering with American foreign policy. And that's exactly what Bill Casey was doing. He had a secret network of operatives. I finally managed to get one of them to talk to me. It took 33 years. This story was really personal to me because I was on and off for more than 30 years. And there were people I approached when I started in 1991 who wouldn't talk for anything. But finally, one after one, they began to open up. And you could see that Casey really did have a secret network that allowed him to meet with, say, a South African arms dealer who sold weapons to Iran, to key officials in Israeli intelligence, that one of Casey's best friends operated as a cutout, that is, as an intermediary to meet with other operatives that were being directed by Casey.
As you said, this is very personal to you. So at one point, while you're trying to get this story out into the open, you are personally sued for $10 million.
Right. I've done 6 books on the Republican Party's assault on democracy. But this one was different. It was deeply, deeply personal. And as an investigative reporter, I was always taught, don't write about yourself. It's not about you. Just stick to the story. In this case, I had to be present because, among other things, I paid a price for this. I was sued. I lost my job. My career was in tatters. And it happened to a lot of other reporters who were on it. And it was sort of extraordinary being at Newsweek with people who I thought were my friends and colleagues, and suddenly I saw them shift to the other side. These were people I'd gone to college with at Harvard. We'd risen up through the ranks. Newsweek was a very powerful organ at the press. I think your younger listeners might not realize that you've grown up in an atomized, siloed world with social media. But back then, the national conversation was really shaped by 2 or 3 networks, broadcasters like Walter Cronkite, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and these news weeklies. So there I was at Newsweek, which was a very powerful organ. We had something like 30 bureaus all over the world with correspondents reporting on stories like this. And I thought, wow, this is going to be like Watergate 2.0. One of my sources on the story was Elliot Richardson, the former attorney general, who was really the moral hero of Richard Nixon. He stood up to Richard Nixon and refused to fire the special prosecutor and allowed Watergate to unravel as it did. He was sort of a hero of mine. He was a source on this story as well. And he told me what happened with the October surprise makes Watergate look like a garden party. And yet here I was at Newsweek, and we started to unravel everything, and suddenly they did a U-turn. It was just extraordinary to me. It was shocking. And even though I was fired, I was being sued for $10 million by Bud McFarlane, who had been Ronald Reagan's national security advisor. But I still kept a hand in it, and I went back to the story again and again. Friends used to tease me that this was my white whale, and it was something I didn't want to let go of. I had to get there. I made special trips over the years, sometimes on my own dime, to Israel. I finally got to Iran in 2014 and to President Bani Sadr in Versailles in 2016. And I learned things that were just extraordinary. When I got to Israel, I met with Yehoshua Sagi, who was director of Israeli military intelligence. And among other things, he told me that, of course, he was talking to Bill Casey in 1979 and 1980. Well, I was just floored by that because Casey was a private citizen then. This was even before he was part of the Reagan campaign. At the time the Iranian Revolution was unfolding, anyone in the Middle East was fixated on that. So this meant that Bill Casey had various intelligence operatives all over the world that he was checking in with even before he joined Ronald Reagan's campaign. And it was quite extraordinary. So I really couldn't let go of this, and I was looking for one final bit of evidence that would make this part of our history if we can accept it.
And I presume there are still people out there who are disputing what you've put in the book.
Right. We've seen this before. The United States does not like to acknowledge its dirty little secrets. I talk about, in the end, I talk a little about Thomas Jefferson, that when he wrote that all men are created equal, well, he wasn't including African Americans who were slaves. He wasn't including women. He wasn't even including 6 of his children who he had with Sally Hemings, who was his slave and mistress. We don't like to acknowledge things like that. When I was a child, my father took me on my first trip to Europe, and we went to Germany. He took me to Dachau. And when you go to the Holocaust, to the death camps, Germany does something quite unusual, which they make them memorials to the victims, not to the perpetrators. They honor the victims. They acknowledge that Germany committed these atrocities. And after I made that trip, I think I was 13 years old. I was in 8th grade or maybe 14. I went back to Texas, and we went on a Texas history trip to San Antonio, where I went to the Alamo. Well, there we cheered Davy Crockett and all these frontiersmen who were sort of American heroes of sort. And it's only many years later that I became aware of the true story of the Alamo, that at the time, Texas was a Mexican province. It was owned by Mexico. At the time, Mexico had just abolished slavery, and the battle at the Alamo was a battle on behalf of the slave owners. So as a child, I was running around with my Davy Crockett lunchbox honoring slavery.
In 91, you start to write about this, but that's the period when this whole story is becoming discredited.
Yes, it was. I mean, it was really sort of one of these shocking moments for me. I've been a reporter for more than 50 years. And when I first got into investigative journalism, I was shaped by stories like Watergate or the Pentagon Papers or the My Lai massacre. These are from the late 60s and early 70s. And there were stories. This was a time when it seemed like organs like CBS News or the New York Times spoke to all of America. We lived in a world where people shared the same facts. We actually had a shared understanding of factual reality. A reporter who broke a big story like that, you could change the national conversation. You could change the course of history. And I was operating under those assumptions when I began investigating the October surprise in 1991. And I was in for a very, very rude surprise because suddenly the entire press corps shut it down. I'd done a major story for Esquire magazine that got a lot of attention. The New York Times had done a big story by Gary Sick that strongly suggested the October surprise had happened. But suddenly, Newsweek had hired me to work on the investigation. And suddenly, the nation's press corps did a 180. They did a U-turn, and they shut it down, and they started doing stories attacking the sources rather than trying to prove what happened. And Newsweek magazine had 3 stories in a row saying the October surprise didn't happen, it didn't happen, It didn't happen. And to me, it was sort of, if you know anything about the news business, news is when something happens. When something happens, you don't run 3 stories in a row saying it didn't happen. So something was up, and I knew I was caught in the middle of a disinformation operation that was really trying to shut down the story and whitewash everything.
So that's even the Washington Post with Bernstein and Woodward.
Well, I talked to Bob Woodward at the time, and he was very, very dubious about him. I quote him in the book. But yeah, so the Washington Post company, by the way, owned Newsweek at that time. The Washington Post still had this halo around it from Watergate, which was, when you think about 52 years ago, it's a halo that lasted a long time. When I was doing my reporting before, it was before the internet. But with the advent of the internet, and especially with social media, I don't think there is a single viable financial model for print journalism. And that means virtually all of print journalism is sort of at the mercy of multi-billionaires.
I think one of the things you say in the book is some of that was around these mainstream media outlets worried about losing their sources by, delving too deep into this.
Right. I think there were 2 reasons. Some of that is, as you say, access journalism. That is, if another contributor at Newsweek when I was there was a guy named Henry Kissinger. And needless to say, he had a lot more clout than I did. And during the Reagan years, it was sort of the White House was a glamorous place. And a lot of people were seduced by that. They loved having sources like Kissinger or Bill Casey, for example, who could feed them stories. If you rely on them exclusively as your sources, you can't contradict them. You have to run what they want you to do. And it can be a road to riches for a reporter, to big headline stories, but it's not necessarily the road to telling the truth. And I wanted to get to the bottom of what really, really happened. So that's a real problem. The other issue in the press corps, I think, was disinformation. And we were venturing into taboo areas in doing this story. The allegations were that what Bill Casey had done was treasonous. He was consorting with a hostile foreign power and sending them weapons, and he was doing so to get one thing in return. He wanted them not to release the American prisoners. He was using the American hostages as pawns for his own partisan agenda. There was a similar problem with Israel, which was deeply involved in this. And if you look at my reporting, you can only conclude that Israel played an active role in a covert operation that sabotaged an American presidential election. Well, they're supposed to be our ally. They're not supposed to be screwing with our sovereignty. And saying that was taboo, and suddenly all sorts of stuff started coming out of the woodwork.
At that time, you're struggling to find the hard evidence to back up your story. So if we can talk about the receipts that you discover.
Absolutely. It took, as I say, another 30 years or so to get what I really wanted. Among those very specific pieces of documents, the receipts, as you put it, I found invoices for weapons that were sold by operatives who were working for Bill Casey. These are the Hashemi brothers. They were 2 Iranian businessmen who were tied into the new regime. And they sold weapons, and I got receipts for the weapons that had ended up in the office of President Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, the president of Iran. And to me, that is proof that weapons were being sold by Bill Casey's operatives to Iran. In this case, the weapons were spare parts for C-130 cargo planes. And I think that's really, incontrovertible evidence that the October surprise actually took place.
I think you managed to get hold of a video which one of your colleagues has filmed an interview with one of the Hashemi brothers.
But Jamshid Hashemi was interviewed by a colleague of mine, the late Bob Perry. And this interview, for the most part, perhaps all of it, was on background, off the record. But in it, he goes on for 90 minutes, a considerable length, about how he first met Bill Casey, who was then working with his brother, Jamshid Hashemi, and how the events unraveled. Among other things, one of the operations they did for Casey was to ship weapons from Israel via a cargo ship to Iran, from the port of Eilat in Israel to Bandar Abbas in Iran. And each time the ship landed at a new port, they would paint it, change its name, and it would sail back from Iran to Israel under a different flag. When it arrived in Israel, they would paint it again, change its name, and still a different flag. And they did that 6 times, 3 round trips over several months. Finally, they took the ship out into the middle of the Mediterranean and sunk it to destroy the evidence.
One of the key arguments against Casey being able to participate in the October surprise was that he was at a meeting in London when key meetings would have been held in Madrid over the arms transfer.
Casey had 2 or 3 phony alibis. And remember, when I was investigating Casey in 91, Casey was already dead by that time. And it was extraordinary how these phony alibis kept popping up for a dead man. But there had been a conference for veterans of the Office of Strategic Services. That was the precursor of the CIA. And Casey played a very, very important role in that in World War II, overseeing the Allied intelligence behind German lines after the Battle of Normandy and D-Day, which proved to lead to the collapse of Adolf Hitler. And he did a very important role in that. And he would go back to these alumni meetings every year or so. And there was one in London that summer. The dispute really had to do with the attendance charts. And as the records were kept, you could see people were checked. There was a pencil mark as to whether they were expected to attend, and an X if they were not. And then once the conference got underway, there would be ink marks if they actually attended. Well, in Casey's case, there were the pencil marks, but no ink marks showing that he had attended on the days in question. But Newsweek and the New Republic chose to give an interpretation, which I think was obviously phony. I print the actual documents in the book, as I print the receipts I just mentioned earlier as well. But the reader can judge for himself. You can see very dark ink marks if he actually attended, but they're only light pencil marks for Casey when he did not attend.
Yeah, and you also managed to interview an operative of Casey who gave you a first-hand account of setting up these meetings.
Right. This is a man named Robert Sensi, and I'd originally tried to talk to him back in 91, and I couldn't get anywhere with people close to Casey back then. But as the years went by, finally I did reach him in fact, it was earlier this year, just before the deadline of my book. And Sensi had been an operative. He was a political operative who was essentially available for hire by Casey. He had worked on several airlines in the Middle East, Royal Kuwaiti Airlines, I believe, among others. And he was a fixer. He would get things done. He spoke Farsi, so he was very useful in that regard. And he told me he traveled with Casey during the October surprise. He helped set up meetings in Madrid for Casey with some of the Iranian officials, including one of the high-ranking clerics, that Casey traveled under a phony passport using the name Daniel O'Neill, that he had a blonde wig. And it happened. He said, I finally just asked, did the October surprise happen? And he said 100 million% it happened, and that he helped set it up.
And you're also helped by some intelligence from the KGB and the US State Department.
Right. There was a congressional investigation that sadly was really pretty much of a whitewash. But among other things, they reached out to the KGB and asked if they had any intelligence on the subject, because this is exactly the kind of thing international intelligence agencies try to look at. At the time, the Soviet Union had just crumbled, and the Russian Federation was rising out of its ashes, and the KGB, which was about to transition to becoming the FSB, was being relatively friendly with the United States, and they said, sure, we will answer their query. It took them, I think, about 3 months to come up with the documents, but they did. By the time they did it, the congressional inquiry was really coming to an end, and they claimed the Russian documents arrived too late. In any case, they kept the documents, and among other documents, including the receipts we just talked about earlier, were filed in a cardboard box, and they were put in an abandoned ladies' room, a storage room really, and where they were stored under the tampon machine. And my colleague, the late Bob Perry, actually tracked them all down in the storage room under the tampon machine, and he kept them for many years. And when I finally got a chance to go through them this year, I was able to discover documents like that. And among them were the Russian intelligence, the KGB intelligence about the October surprise. And they said definitively that, yes, it did happen.
Because the Casey meetings in Madrid are really the main area of contention as to how people previously have said, no, this never happened.
And that's why it was such a point of contention for decades. And if Casey met in Madrid with the Iranians, the October surprise happened. I mean, it's really, that would be the central point of proof. And I think my colleague Bob Perry proved it, but it really didn't get the attention it deserved. And I went back. I think it's important to make this part of a known part of American history. It's not a pretty part, but we have to embrace even the dark side of our past to know what really happened. Otherwise, it'll happen again. And that's what I see. That's why I see it so relevant today. It's using a hostile foreign power and hijacking American foreign policy to work with a hostile foreign power for your partisan advantage, and using hostages as pawns in the process.
You also managed to interview the late Iranian president, Bani Sadr.
Bani Sadr is what I call him. And yes, I interviewed him in 2016. And among other things, he told me the whole story of the October surprise from the Iranian side, in which you see that it was not just a coup d'etat of sorts in that it sabotaged Jimmy Carter's presidency, but it did the same in Iran as well. And Bani Sadr, as a result, he tried to fight it. He saw it happening. He told me firsthand what was going on in Iran, never reported before. He was impeached when he tried to stop the October surprise. He survived 3 assassination attempts. And finally, he fled to Paris, where he lived in exile just outside Paris. You know, he gave me about 4 hours of his time. He was in his 80s, and his memory was still quite good. But at the very end of my interview with him, I asked him, look, it had been 36 years since the October surprise. Now it's 44. And I said, do you think people really care? Do you think it still makes a difference? And he said, absolutely. You have to write it. If you don't, it will happen again and again.
One of the surprising things that I wasn't aware of was you come up with allegations of sabotage with Carter's rescue attempt, Eagle Claw.
Right. This is, to my mind, it's still inconclusive, but there's a lot of really compelling evidence, the most important of which is I was able to acquire the unpublished memoirs of a very, very high-level Palestinian intelligence operative named Mustafa Zain. Mustafa Zain had been a colleague of Yasser Arafat. He was head of intelligence for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and he was also in close contact with the KGB. And Jimmy Carter was reaching out through the Palestinians to try to get them to help resolve the hostage crisis. And Bill Casey knew that, and he thwarted that outreach. And Mustafa Zain, in his memoirs, says one that he believed that Casey had really sabotaged this rescue operation that Jimmy Carter tried in April of 1980. 3 helicopter that were part of the rescue attempt suddenly failed. There were only 8, and that left the United States with not enough choppers to continue the mission, so it was all aborted. And there is reason to believe it was sabotaged, but I don't think it's really been proven conclusively.
Right, so it's suspicions there rather than anything conclusive.
Yes.
Okay. Now, a lot of people will have heard of the Iran-Contra affair. How does that link into this?
Right. Well, the Iran-Contra affair, as far as American consumers of news knew, was the first major scandal after Watergate. And this was during the Reagan administration between 1984 and 1986. There were televised hearings, and it concerned illegal arms sales to Iran, in which the profits were being diverted to arm right-wing rebels, the Contras, in Nicaragua. This was, when you look at the affair, you look at all these illegal arms sales to Iran, and you kind of wonder, well, when did this start? How did that come about? And I think the answer is really it was a continuation of the October surprise. The October surprise of 1980 was the origin of Iran-Contra, because that's when an illegal arms channel through Israel opened up, and it simply continued from the end of the Carter administration through Reagan's first administration and right into Iran-Contra.
And there's controversy around this because there's some involvement with George H.W. Bush in this as well.
Yes, there was a lot of controversy over whether or not George H.W. Bush actively participated in the October surprise. A number of people, including the KGB documents, said that Bush was in Paris meeting with the Iranians in the final meeting in late October to seal the deal. I don't quite go so far as to say it's conclusive, but there is a considerable amount of evidence suggesting that's so. And Bush, of course, when you look at what grew out of the October surprise, there were 5 presidential administrations as a result of it. Ronald Reagan was elected and then reelected with George Bush Sr. as his vice president. Then the senior George Bush himself was elected as president. He was a one-term president, defeated by Bill Clinton, but later Bush's son, George W. Bush, was elected to 2 presidencies. And between those 5 administrations, they appointed 8 Supreme Court justices. So this affected several branches of government and resulted in a major shift to the right in the United States. Part of my point about the October surprise of 1980 is not the first time it happened. And I think it may be worth going back to the beginning. That is, in the mid-60s, President Lyndon Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And when he did that, he did it at great cost to the Democratic Party, which then had a lot of racist Southern senators. And as soon as he did that, signed that, and those laws went into effect, those racist right-wing senators switched parties, and they became Republicans. Thereafter, starting in 1968, the Republicans used what they called the Southern strategy. And if you look at the electoral map of red states versus blue states, starting in 1968, the red states look very similar to the Confederate States of America. And that happens almost every year. There have been a few anomalies when the Democrats have had a southern nominee like Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter. But other than that, the southern states are red, red, red. And the way they dealt with that was in 1968, Nixon knew he may lose the election. At the time, Lyndon Johnson was trying to negotiate an end to the Vietnam War through peace talks in Paris. But Nixon reached out to a woman named Anna Chennault. She was a Chinese national who'd married an American general. She happened to have high-level contacts in Vietnam. And at Nixon's behest, she told the president of South Vietnam not to join the Paris peace talks, to refuse to join them, and they backed out of them at the last minute. When that happened in the final week of October, this was Nixon's October surprise. No one knew about it at the time. But suddenly, the Democrats had egg on their face. They'd set up these peace talks, and they couldn't even get their allies in South Vietnam to attend. As a result, Nixon won the election in a squeaker. But afterwards, he was kind of scared. He thought the Democrats may have tapes of these conversations or various documents. He was paranoid that they would release them when he was running for re-election in 1972. So Nixon put together a group of burglars known as the White House Plumbers, and they broke into offices at the Brookings Institute and at a residential office complex where the Democrats seemed to had their national headquarters, that was known as the Watergate. And this, of course, led to the Watergate scandal. So there you have two abrogations in 1968 and 72. In 1980, you have the October surprise that I'm writing about.
Is there no equivalent of a Democrat president or people working for a Democrat president getting up to anything of a similar scale to this in terms of illegality?
I think there's not. And the reason is the Democrats are Democrats, and that's not what Democrats do. This is a violation of the Constitution. If I'm to criticize the Democrats, and I do, it is that they've been lapdogs when they really have to be put balls. They need to be fighting Democrats.
The book is called Den of Spies, Reagan, Carter and the Secret History of the Treason That Stole the White House by Craig Unger. There's links in the episode notes for you to buy the book and support the podcast. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.